Well, why don't we start, unless Nick, if that sounds good to you. All right, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Sam Levin. I'm a reporter with The Guardian, pronouns he, him. I'm a staff writer based in Los Angeles. I cover criminal justice and policing and incarceration, and spent a lot of time over the last year reporting on police violence in LA, as well as the COVID crisis behind bars, and have also been covering the movements to defund police and take on police unions. I'm super thrilled to be hosting this panel with these organizers and scholars. We'll be discussing the defund and abolition movements, campaigns against ICE, and alternatives to incarceration. Going to do some quick intros and then we'll dive right into questions, and people feel free to leave comments and questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. First, we have Yvette Alley, who is a queer Latinx grassroots organizer and advocate leading abolitionist campaigns in California. Their history growing up in Southern California as an undocumented person and as the child of an incarcerated person continues to inform their activism. As the campaign coordinator for Justice LA, Yvette led the coalition to historic victories, including ending LA County's $3.5 billion jail expansion plan in 2019 and the adoption of LA County's Alternatives to Incarceration roadmap last year. They serve as a senior policy lead for Dignity and Power Now and co-founder of La Defensa. Hi, Yvette, thank you so much for joining us. Next, we have Priscilla Gonzalez, who is campaigns director at Mi Gente, a digital and grassroots hub for Latinx and Chicanx organizing and movement building. Over the past 2 decades, she has worked at the intersection of racial, gender, and economic justice, helping to lead game-changing grassroots campaigns. And last but not least, we have Ajay Clemens, who is a PhD candidate in public policy at Duke University. Ajay's research examines policing of African American and European Muslim communities and the factors most important in helping or harming the police-community relationship. Previously, Ajay served as policy director for a DC-based association of 700 African American state legislators. Ajay also helped establish a municipal agency within the city and county of Denver, the Office of the Independent Monitor, which provides civilian oversight of police and sheriff internal affairs investigations. Thank you three for being here today. I'm so excited to have this conversation. I thought we'll just dive right into questions, and all folks feel free to interrupt at any time, but I thought we could start with you, Yvette. Obviously, we've seen, defund the police become this kind of rallying cry over the last year. And I'd love to hear from you just what the idea of defunding means to you in your own life and work. And, if there are any personal stories or experiences you can share to talk about how you came to understand the idea of defunding of police and abolition.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sam. Defund the police has been really a rallying cry that's taken hold in the last year. But this concept of divest, invest is not new. Organizations and coalitions like Californians United for a Responsible Budget, which has been doing this work for nearly 20 years, advocating to shift funding out of law enforcement, out of incarceration, and into our communities. They've really been leading the charge here in California for a very long time. Ruthie Gilmore is a scholar, an abolitionist scholar that has been pushing these ideas for a very, very long time. So I just want to start there. This is not a new concept, but over the last year with the uprisings, this idea has really taken hold. And for me, the key pieces are not just the divest piece, right? Like the shifting of funds, the defunding of police. And I would extend that to not just police departments, but incarceration, and law enforcement in all of its forms, and that includes probation departments, that includes our local police, sheriff's departments, the district attorney's office, and of course jails, prisons, and immigrant prisons included in that. And the second piece is the invest. So it's not just about taking the money out of these systems of harm, which yes, will help alleviate the interactions between law enforcement and our community members. But the key piece is that our communities have been divested from for generations, right? Here in Los Angeles County, 1 out of every $5 goes directly to the sheriff's department. We have the second largest county budget, second only to New York. And the majority of our budget goes to law enforcement and incarceration probation departments. And so because those dollars have been steadily shifted towards punitive systems and away away from our communities. Our communities have been suffering from economic divestment. So the crux of this call is really to invest in community-based services, invest in housing, invest in community-based medical care. Those are the things we want to fund. So it's not just what we want to dismantle, it's what we want to build with these dollars, right? And so often that piece of the conversation gets lost. People have this visceral reaction about defunding the police, and I'm not one to advocate that we should dilute that message in any way. That's absolutely the message that we should be propagating. But the crux of investment is where a lot of folks that's the piece people miss. And so when I think about my own experience being undocumented here, having an incarcerated parent, my family didn't have any family here. We had no support network whatsoever. And so we had a situation where we lost our housing. My whole family became houseless as a result of the incarceration of my parent. We had no system of care. We were completely isolated. And if our communities had those levels of investment that we're advocating for here in LA County and across California, and I would say across the country, vulnerable families, vulnerable community members, like my family, like our other immigrant and undocumented community members, like our trans and gender nonconforming community members that are really left out of the equation when we're thinking about services, we would have a safety net. We would have the ability to not just survive, but to thrive. So it's really about building up the type of world that we want to see where all of us are taken care of.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Yvette, for sharing all of that and for providing the kind of foundation for understanding this concept. I really appreciate it. I'd love to move to Priscilla. If you can talk a bit about what defunding means to you, and also how much has shifted over the last year. As Yvette said, this is not new. I remember writing about these kind of jobs, not jails campaign in Oakland, 7 years ago. But obviously there is now this mainstream attention to it. This is a national conversation in a way that's never been. How has that shifted your work?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this conversation, Sam, for facilitating, and it's great to be in conversation with Ajay and Yvette. So I grew up in the New York City of the 70s and the 80s, witnessing police occupying the neighborhood where I grew up and other poor neighborhoods across the city, having family members get thrown into the system. And as a young activist, I was active in Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. I was so lucky to have found that national collective, having crossed paths with it, because that's where I learned how to analyze and understand the role, the many forms of state violence in our lives, and the role, the purpose that plays, particularly as Black and Brown communities are its target. And then, of course, also following the leadership of Black women and Black and Brown trans communities in learning how community-led and community-based solutions around harms were things that we needed to be fighting for. So Yvette laid it out perfectly, so I won't repeat, because I completely, that is also my understanding and what I believe defund the police as a strategy and as a demand is all about. So I'll speak to this moment that we're in and how I'm kind of understanding it. So definitely, I think that that although it's been a long-standing issue, there is an opening like we've never seen before, with mass attention being paid to policing and specifically to the disproportionate funding that goes to police departments at a time when Black and Brown communities in particular have been battling a pandemic that has torn through our families and our communities, and where state inaction has taken lives and left people without any kind of safety net. So more of the public, I think, has also seen more and more police killings. So there's an opportunity, I think, to talk about this as a systemic problem and not as a case of good versus bad apples. Although, the opposition will continue to try to drill that. But it's an opportunity that we, and an opening that we haven't had thanks to the uprisings, and there's more platforms available to us than we've ever had to really educate the public about the inadequacy of reforms, based on really concrete experiences. The fact that, for instance, like in New York, the New York Police Department had already had a rule in place that chokeholds were banned, and yet that is exactly what Daniel Pantaleo used to murder Eric Garner. So that's an opportunity to really point out the inadequacy of those reforms. And just speaking as an organization that organizes Latinos in particular, there is also an opening here to organize and really build organizing infrastructure and unite Latinos around this issue, because there is also greater national attention paid to deaths at the hands of police, again, thanks to the movement for Black Lives. And even though, and I hope we get to talk about this a little bit later, but there's been organizing that's been happening for decades, but still this is not an issue that registers as an urgent concern for the community at large, to the extent that we can talk about Latinos en masse, because we're not a monolith. But yeah, we're far behind in terms of understanding this as a systemic issue, not least of which because there just isn't data, right, available to show the scale and scope of how this issue impacts our community, especially the most marginalized. I think, as Yvette was pointing out, trans Latinx folks, Black Latinx folks, undocumented folks, for example, and we need an organized community to fight back, fight in the name of those who've been taken from us, and fight in and flank the movement for Black lives. And the last thing that I'll say is that, countless families, Latinx families, have been affected by police violence very directly. And there is grieving that has happened behind closed doors and away from the public eye. So I think there is also terrain here to kind of try to seize and organize, and really be there for one another at a greater scale, and flex political muscle to really demand and win the changes that we need.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, for that overview and bringing us into this current moment and where things are at. I really appreciate it. To move to you, Ajay, I would love to just hear a bit about, as there is all of this momentum now, like what kinds of research are you paying attention to, or projects related to this umbrella of defunding that are most sort of interesting or compelling in this moment?
Well, thanks, Sam. And echoing the sentiments earlier, I'm just so honored to be here and part of this important conversation, and joining Yvette and Priscilla. I lift up and affirm everything that's been said, so I don't want to repeat any of that. But I'll say this, in terms of, defunding the police, first we have to stop the policy violence that's occurring, right? Folks are actively being poisoned, in literally and figuratively. And then there's the disinvestment that Yvette talked about, the divestment and the disinvestment for generations, and the sort of stealing and transferring, the siphoning of wealth and redistributing it to the top, right? And then this police bit. So there have been at least 17 jurisdictions. There may be more now, or perhaps fewer if folks have backpedaled, that have agreed to sort of defund on some level. 17 across the country, so that's not very many, because you're talking about 18,000. But it's interesting because Boston, Los Angeles, and New York City have vowed to cut 12 million, 150 million, $1 billion respectively from their police budgets. Minneapolis voted to disband altogether. I don't think too many have gotten in that boat, but the devil's in the details, and where all of these cities reallocate their dollars is going to be significant in determining whether or not such moves will be successful. I don't think there's been enough time academically to state, it's very much an open question whether these moves have been effective. But one of the things that we see historically with progressive victories, when folks have fought and won, is that there are these intense policy backlashes at the state level from the state capitals that, pass these sweeping powers that then usurp local jurisdiction. So, these mantras of local control have often got out the window real quickly when folk don't like who has local control. There are a couple of models that could be placed under the defunding column, if you will, and that have been tested by researchers. And so one I want to mention is the violence interrupters model, because this is very specific to communities where there are these really high levels of homicide and attempted homicide rate. So I want to point that out. This is not targeting typical communities. These are like very communities that are suffering from great deals of violent crime that have been proven to be effective and far more effective than police. So the violence interrupters model comes out of Chicago ceasefire. Dr. Gary Slutkin is an epidemiologist who kind of took the models that he saw in how violence spreads in cholera and in tuberculosis and refugee camps, and use that to model how violence can spread in a population. And so basically he pioneered this model where you're paying folks who have been in this life and who are credible messengers, and but who are not active now, but have these networks still where they're engaged. And then, training them in some persuasion and other things. They're keeping tabs on, who has beef and all this. And then they're interrupting it. They're mediating it, and they're mediating it successfully. They're connecting folks to outreach specialists who are then getting them embedded in community resources. So you have to set all that up in place. And those reinvestments in the police budget have been effective, had driven down homicide and attempted homicide rates anywhere between 40 and 70% in the US and abroad. And so the model has been replicated, but you have to replicate it correctly in order for it to work. I would point to another model that comes out of Richmond, California. This is Operation Peacemaker Fellowship by Devon Boggin. He kind of took that model and then kicked it up several notches. And notice that, even though Richmond, California had about 100,000 people, it's a pretty small size city, but it had this really excessive, very high amounts of murder, of homicides. However, they were really being committed by a very small fraction of folks. So getting the city, the Office of the Neighborhood Safety, to invest and identify folks who were particularly at risk, then giving them stipends of $1,000 a month for meeting goals that they set jointly with staff. They had 24-hour wraparound services. They had all kinds of, therapy, mentoring, job training. They got them connected to jobs. And then they were able to see a reduction of 43% in crimes, 55% fewer deaths. So, really outsized impact for the small investment relatively. So I'll stop there with these kinds of interventions, but there's obviously a lot more that we can say in the discussion.
Yeah, well, thanks for those examples. That's really helpful. I'd love to actually hear from Yvette. Ajay was mentioning the $150 million cut in LA police budget that the mayor announced last year, and there was a lot of fanfare around that. I was reporting on it, and I know since then there's been a lot of scrutiny of that cut. What did it actually accomplish, and is that really significant, and are the funds actually being reinvested? I don't know how much you're closely following this, Yvette, but just big picture, what you make of the specific progress or lack thereof that LA has made, on this issue moving forward.
Yeah, LA loves to signal progressive shifts, but when it comes to actually materializing those shifts, is very slow. So there's the LA City law enforcement budget, and then there's the LA County law enforcement budget, right? And Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has been really leading the charge with the people's budget on the LA city side. On the LA County side, the county has really been signaling around what they call the care first, jail last model. So I don't know if this is the right moment for me to delve into like the alternatives to incarceration piece. Yeah. So LA County, when they decided to stop jail expansion, so we defeated the $3.5 billion jail expansion plan, in the same breath, they instituted what's called the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group. And so the Board of Supervisors appointed community members to sit on this body alongside county department representatives. So we had the sheriff's department in there, we had the probation department, the public defenders, the DAs, sitting across from community. And so the ATI work group was the decision-making body on what recommendations were going to be uplifted to the board. But the process of the development of the recommendations was open to anybody. So the community really flooded that space, and we delivered some of the most progressive recommendations in the state, including things like safe consumption housing. And so this report was delivered to the board and adopted in March of last year. The board has since been dragging their feet in terms of actually allocating funds for this, because this will mean significantly shifting money out of the sheriff's department and out of the probation department. So far, they've maintained both the probation budget and the sheriff's budget. No significant changes have been made. They started funding the ATI initiative little by little. There was like $100 million that was allocated last fall. I'm sure we'll delve into Measure J a little bit and the significance of that. So this hasn't actually materialized. We have our budget decision June 28th. So in the next few weeks, the board is really going to be making a decision about putting their money where their mouth is. We've done the ATI report, the Men's Central Jail closure report. So now we've shifted from building 2 jails to closing Men's Central Jail. And we delivered that report. So it's been report after report. And this is like a lesson learned that I hope folks, note, is that, one of the tactics of the bureaucracy is to just demand a bunch of reports to validate what they don't have the political will and the political courage to actually implement, because they know we need to close down Men's Central Jail. They know we need to invest in alternatives to incarceration. They got a whole roadmap through the ATI report, but yet they keep asking for these reports in order to validate what they already know is true and to do what they force their hand, which is why we passed Measure J, and why we created Measure J is to force the county's hand to actually make those budget allocations. Los Angeles has this notion that we're such a progressive bastion, that California, like we're so progressive here. But the reality is Los Angeles is the epicenter of jailing in the whole world. We incarcerate more people in our county jails than any other jail system on the planet. California is one of the largest incarcerating states. And so there's like a disconnect between what the leadership promises to do or tries to placate mobilizing in Los Angeles. But the reality is we haven't seen those shifts yet, not in any significant way. So they keep signaling nothing has materialized, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, you really get at the kind of obstacles to actually implementing these changes just with how slow it moves and how much the cities can sort of co-opt the language around this work. I'd love to hear from Priscilla about another sort of obstacle, which is that there's just the really intense kind of backlash we're seeing right now as defunding police becomes the national slogan. There is, of course, just an intense like Republican and conservative backlash, but there is also backlash from Democrats and liberal mayors and sometimes local media with these reports about purported increases in crime or kind of fear mongering about quote unquote dangerous criminals being released and things like that. And I'm just wondering from an organizing perspective, how you counter that or how you deal with that type of opposition.
Yeah, I think there's a part of this that's an air war. We have to show there is data. We have to show that police have never actually been responsible for crime reduction. There's a number of studies that show that it's life-sustaining things like good jobs, quality education, affordable housing, mental health, community programs and services that are the things that have a qualitatively more significant impact. I think it was in maybe the opening plenary where Kelly Lytle Hernandez said that 8% police's work is actually responding to the things that people are scared about and fearful of. So these are data points. There is evidence to show, right, and to push back, particularly against those arguments that we need to flood the streets with police in order to have public safety. I think also a part of this is targeting the media as complicit in irresponsible reporting and disseminating what are essentially is an ideological framework versus doing kind of the honest and straightforward reporting about what's really happening on the ground and lifting up this other evidence. I think also what's important is continuing to lift up our stories and the stories of those who've been directly impacted, both individuals and communities at large. And then as organizers, we have to keep doing the organizing, keep doing the deep work of engaging community members, educating, and continuing to lift up and inspire a vision for a just society that starts with a reallocation of resources that centers our humanity and pushes back against these systems that try to dehumanize us.
Yeah, absolutely. And great point about the media as well. Something I obviously think about a lot from my job, and always trying to root the sort of work in the facts and the reality of what actually police do on a day-to-day basis and what they don't do. And that's so crucial. So I appreciate that comment. Ajay, I'd love to ask you just a bit about police settlements, because that's something I've been thinking about a lot in the context of police budgets. We know that police spend a lot of money paying for, misconduct, abuse, and violence and cases they face. And I was talking to a loved one of someone killed by police yesterday, actually, about this, who was, saying how sad it is to think about her own kind of taxpayer money going to sort of pay for these abuses. And I know you've looked into this. I don't know if you can speak just a bit about, how much police actually spend for the violence that they've caused and, what the typical causes of that are. And then we'll move on to questions. So people feel free to keep throwing those in the chat.
Sure. It's in the billions, because Chicago alone in recent years has spent over $400 million in payouts. Boston, for example, had there was a situation there where when the Red Sox won the series, there were some demonstrations in the crowd, and so a young white woman, she was maybe 21 years old, had a pepper ball sprayed directly into her eye, and it actually got lodged into her brain, and she died 13 hours later. That wound up with first of all, they issued an immediate apology for her death, promised reforms, said the officers were devastated by the mistake, that it was an accident, teamed up with the young woman's family to sue the manufacturer, talking about they didn't know that it was possible for it to be lethal, and issued immediate reforms for crowd dispersal. But that was a multi-million-dollar payout to the family. There was a situation in New York where a lot of times when white folks live in these high rises, they're allowed to have pets on their roofs and everything. But in these cases, people are often kept from going onto their roof. And so they actually had armed officers at the top of the roof policing people coming onto the roof. And so these kids were going to go there and for a party and stuff, and scared the officers. So the officer just shot when they came through the door. And so that that wound up with like a $2 million payout. So a lot of the payouts are around wrongful deaths. They're extremely, extremely difficult to win and to get to that point. And so as much as the payouts are happening, it's actually like, should be a lot more for the ways in which these things are occurring.
Thank you. We're going to go to a few questions from the audience. One we got was, I think, probably for a good one for Yvette to answer, is about probation and parole officers. When we're thinking about sort of problematic probation and parole officers, are we talking about wholesale replacement or more oversight and training? How do you deal with problematic probation and parole?
I would say we deal with problematic probation or parole officers the way that we deal with, or should be dealing with, law enforcement in all of its forms. It's to actually eliminate those positions. We shouldn't have probation departments surveilling our community members. We should have community-based social workers and peer navigators. So, really moving away from this notion of supervision and monitoring towards a service mechanism that's actually embedded in the community. One of the big challenges around defunding the law enforcement in all of its forms is really the unions, including the probation unions here in California. And so one of the things that we're tackling in partnership with our labor partners here in Los Angeles is this idea of a just transition. We believe everybody should have access to a well-paying living wage job that provides them with benefits and that is actually healing for their communities, and where that employment actually contributes to the safety and healing of the communities, not punitive responses. And so part of a just transition model really takes from the framework that Indigenous community members have really led on in terms of switching from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. Same framework, it's the same blueprint, moving from a punitive carceral economy to a restorative care first economy. And so the idea here is that we can shift probation officers, good and bad, into other jobs that are actually restorative and can support our communities. But also keeping in mind that, some of these jobs, whether it's someone, that's working in a prison or in the community supervising through probation, these are very traumatizing to not just to the communities that are being impacted, but to the person themselves. I was reading a statistic around prison guards that their average life expectancy is like 59 years old, compared to 75 for the average person in the United States. These are very harmful, toxic, like physically toxic and traumatizing jobs. So I would say for the healing wellness of everyone, all parties, both those that work in law enforcement and the community, just shifting those jobs completely and reimagining what those jobs can look like.
Thank you for that systemic analysis. Really appreciate that. We have another question from Representative Romero, who is asking, how do we focus lawmakers' energy for the biggest wins? Is it a focus on police culture and department reform, wraparound services, budgets to balance priorities? We just got rid of qualified immunity in New Mexico and automatically expunged records for small cannabis-related crimes and more. We're on the right track, but we are still struggling with some of the largest unconstitutional policing practices in the nation, namely in our Albuquerque metro area. I don't know who wants to take that, just talking about sort of organizing around politics, but I'd love to hear some thoughts on that. Thanks for the question. Priscilla, are you interested in answering that one?
Sure. So I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that as we're given all of the problems with policing that we've been talking about and that have been exposed at a greater scale over this past year, and as in different cities, advocates and organizers are trying to move different policies and try to get budget cuts moved in the police department. I think a really good measure of how effective we're being, that I try to always keep in my mind, is what is going to reduce the power of the police department? What is going to reduce the size, the scale, the scope, all of the things that actually lead to police acting in unaccountable ways and that lead police to having a ton of interactions in our communities that lead to fatalities and that lead to violence. So that's where I would start. There's also just a lot in terms of a framing. There's also just so much secrecy and so much stuff that happens behind the scenes that we don't know about, that I think particularly for elected officials who have greater access than the public, to be really rigorous about investigation. And that's something that like as an organizer, I've learned one of the things that we've been doing, for example, at Mi Gente, is peeling back the police budgets and actually seeing not only what are all the sources of funding, but also what kinds of contracts are police having. So in particular, building out of our No Tech for ICE campaign, which was targeting technology companies that were helping ICE build up their infrastructure to detain and deport migrants in the country. We've been learning that that these are the same companies that also have contracts with local police departments. And we saw just like the type of military grade, not just military grade weaponry, but also these like highly technological tools and surveillance apparatuses that local police departments have access to and are using. So targeting those contracts, for instance, is one way that we've been trying to get at reducing the power, trying to take away their toys, just as one strategy. And it always comes back to, I think, as one panelist said in another panel, that part of it is following the money, so that we could try to find different ways to reduce the power and the authority of police in our communities.
Yeah.
I would if I could just add one thing to that, because I think that that was fantastic, and I'm glad that you took that on first. Ben Grunwald, law professors Grunwald and Rappaport issued an article. They did a study. This came out in 2020, I believe, or 2021, and found, using Florida's all of Florida's officers, that officers who have been fired by a police department are actually more likely to be fired again in their next position than officers who have never been fired or rookies. And they also found that these, what they called wandering officers, were more likely to go to smaller departments that were less resourced, so poorer departments, like poorer communities, with even more people of color in them. And so there's a sort of predatory aspect to incompetence that we need to be sensitive to. One of the things that state lawmakers can do is ensure that there's some databases and some sharing, so that these kinds of officers can be found and their records not protected.
Yeah, thank you for that. One question that I had thinking about these, reforms and the models to do this is, we're seeing a lot of cases in which police are attempting to actually increase their budgets under the guise of reform. It's happening in LA around sort of the protest response scrutiny, and certainly comes with, what you were talking about related to just getting equipment or more training. And I'm just wondering, what you make of that response to this moment from cities. If anyone wants to answer that, we don't have a ton of time left, but if anyone feels interested in answering that, I'd love to hear some thoughts.
Just briefly, and then I'll pass it to Yvette and Ajay, the system is always going to find a way to morph, and we need to be 5 steps ahead, trying to scenario out what they might do in response, but also really unpack the so-called reforms that come out of the state and not coming from community, because these are tricks that are not new. They're always going to be there to confuse the public and to try to appease advocates so that we go away.
Yeah, I completely 100% agree with Priscilla. You know, here in Los Angeles County, our sheriff, like one of the most corrupt, murderous sheriffs we've had in LA County history. You know, when the uprisings were happening and a lot of critiques were mounting against, you know, use of force and the need for reform in law enforcement, he said, you know, we've already implemented all these reforms, but it still has not translated to, you know, our community members not being killed on the street. You know, it's really about, like Priscilla said earlier, shifting the power away from law enforcement, reducing the scope, reducing their size, reducing their contact with our community members. Because the best way to stop law enforcement violence is to eliminate the contact between our community members and law enforcement. If they're not there to shoot our community members, they're not going to die at the hands of police. And so these reforms are often tied to more money for those departments, and that money, you know, often goes into, you know, the abyss of a sheriff's budget and doesn't actually translate. Like cameras, you know, body cameras, they're often used to actually criminalize our community members. And so in the board of supervisors gave the sheriff's department millions of dollars for these cameras, and yet they weren't implemented as well. And so it doesn't, you know, bringing more resources to law enforcement doesn't really translate to safety for our community members. So we have to be really mindful of that. This also includes supervision. As a response to Asian hate, you know, the law enforcement was like, we need more cameras, we need more surveillance, right? But the reality is added surveillance is used to criminalize and target, you know, immigrant communities, Black community members, you know, Muslim community members. And so it's really another attempt of law enforcement to expand its scope and expand its reach.
Yeah.
I would just like to add one caveat to that. So I agree with everything that's been said, but there's one caveat. If you're going to increase any sort of police budget, if that happens, it should be to make them actually more effective at their jobs, not, you know, getting them newer cars and new walkie-talkies or whatever. And so the one area where that would make sense potentially is around increasing clearance of for homicide cases. Right now, I think most Americans would be shocked to know how what the poor odds that people can get away with murder in this country. And so, you know, Wesley Lowery at the Washington Post, along with some others, found that in like 52 of the largest cities, they for cases in which the victim was white, 47% of those cases, it was open, like those cases were not solved. And it's even worse in some places like Chicago. It goes down to 22% if the victim's Black, 33% if the victim is Hispanic, 47% if the victim is white. Boston had some reforms around this and was able to improve their clearance rates by 10 percentage points within just a couple of years. So this is an area where you can invest in more staffing, you can invest in training and in particular kinds of equipment, 3D, you know, technology and things like that to kind of reconstruct events. But that is a very specific thing that the police are expected to do and should actually be doing much better.
Well, thank you so much. We're at closing time here, but I would love to just give all of you a brief moment to say any closing remarks. You know, I was thinking just for folks here, like, you know, what the best way is to get involved. If you want to share a few words on that for the organizers in this group, or anything you didn't get to that you want to share on the subject. If we want to start with Yvette.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I just want to thank you, Sam, for facilitating this, and Priscilla and Ajay. It's been a pleasure to be on this panel with you all. If folks are in Los Angeles or are interested in learning more about what we do, the Justice LA Coalition at justicelaNow.org is a great resource and platform where you can see our reports. We've been doing Care First budgets and decarceration budgets for LA County for a number of years. So you can take a look at ours, use that as a template for your jurisdiction, for your county. I would also direct you all to our social media accounts at Justice Alley Now on Instagram and Twitter. That's where we post a lot of our virtual actions. And if you need support with amplification around a virtual action, reach out to us through our platforms. We support campaigns, from across the country and across the state, and love to build solidarity and learn from one another. So please do reach out.
Thank you so much. Priscilla, want to say a few closing remarks?
Yeah, just that folks can, Mi Gente is a membership organization, so inviting folks to join if you identify as Latinx. We've got some exciting stuff coming down the pike over the summer related to organizing Latinxes around policing nationally. And then also on the immigration front, doing a lot of work there right now to pressure the Biden administration. So folks should sign up to our list and visit our website and plug in, because there's a lot to do. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Ajay, any closing remarks from you?
Sure. Just a pleasure again to be with you all. I think this is very exciting, and the bottom line is that folks have to be on the ground, and they have to force action. They have to force these conversations. They're not going to give it up. They're not going to give up that power willingly, and so we have to take it.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for all your wisdom and spending time. I really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone for watching. And yeah, I'm a reporter with The Guardian, so if anyone has any story ideas on policing that we should be covering or feedback on our work, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, thank you all so much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Take care.